Power is the ultimate high-wire act. Throughout history, men and women have climbed to the very top of the mountain, commanding armies, dictating laws, and shaping the destiny of millions. But the climb is often easier than the stay. For every leader who manages to pass the torch peacefully and retire to a quiet life, there are dozens who find themselves pushed, pulled, or dragged from the seat of authority. History is littered with the crowns of those who thought they were indispensable, only to realize that the higher you go, the thinner the air becomes and the more people there are waiting for you to stumble. Today we are breaking down every way powerful leaders lost power, explained in detail. We aren't just talking about losing an election. We are looking at the dramatic collapses, the internal betrayals, the economic meltdowns, and the strange twists of fate that turned masters of the world into historical footnotes overnight. This is the anatomy of the fall. And if you listen closely, you might just hear the warning signs that history has been shouting at us for 3,000 years. The most common way a leader loses power, and perhaps the most predictable, is through the uprising of the very people they're supposed to lead. This is the classic revolutionary arc. It usually begins not with a grand political idea, but with a hungry stomach. When a leader becomes so detached from the reality of the streets that they no longer understand the basic needs of the population, a timer starts ticking. Take the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. King Louis XVI didn't necessarily set out to be a tyrant, but he inherited a system that was broke and a population that was starving. While the elite were attending balls at Versailles, the people of Paris couldn't afford a loaf of bread. The loss of power happened in stages. First, a loss of economic trust, then a loss of symbolic authority, and finally, a physical removal from the palace. When the people realized that the king was just a man who could be surrounded and detained, the divine right evaporated instantly. This taught the world a vital lesson. Power is a social contract, and if you stop providing the basics of life, the contract is canceled without notice. But sometimes, the threat doesn't come from the streets. It comes from the hallway right outside the leader's bedroom. This is the internal coup, or the palace betrayal. History's most famous example is Julius Caesar. He wasn't unpopular with the common people of Rome. In fact, they loved him. He had expanded the empire and brought home massive wealth. But he had forgotten the golden rule of power. Don't humiliate your peers. By declaring himself dictator for life, he stripped the Roman Senate of their sense of importance. The loss of power for Caesar didn't come from a foreign army or a peasant revolt, but from the daggers of the people he considered his closest colleagues. This is a recurring theme in the history of empires. From the Roman Praetorian Guard to the Soviet Politburo, many leaders have been removed not by their enemies, but by their loyal supporters who decided that the leader had become a liability, or that it was simply their turn to sit in the big chair. Another path to the exit is the military defeat in a war of one's own making. Hubris is the great destroyer of leaders. When a ruler begins to believe their own propaganda and thinks they are a military genius, they often pick a fight they can't win. Napoleon Bonaparte is the poster child for this. He conquered most of Europe, but he couldn't conquer the Russian winter or the combined resolve of his neighbors. His loss of power happened twice. The first time, he was forced to abdicate and sent to a tiny Mediterranean island. But because he still had that intoxicating taste for power, he escaped and tried to do it all again, only to be defeated once more at Waterloo. This time, his peers made sure he was sent to the middle of the Atlantic, where he could never return. Napoleon's fall shows us that military power is a double-edged sword. If you build your entire identity on being an invincible conqueror, the moment you lose a battle, you lose your reason to lead. In the modern world, we've developed a much more civilized but equally brutal way for leaders to lose power: the democratic election. In a democracy, a leader is on a lease. Every few years, they have to go back to the landlord, which is the voting public, and ask to stay. Think of Winston Churchill. In 1845, he was the hero who had led Britain through its darkest hour and helped win World War II. He was arguably the most famous and respected man on the planet. Yet just weeks after the victory in Europe, the British people voted him out of office in a landslide. They didn't hate him, but they were tired of war and wanted a leader who would focus on housing and healthcare rather than grand strategy. Churchill's loss of power was a shock to the world, but it proved that in a healthy society, no leader, not even a hero, is bigger than the needs of the people. Then there is the slow, grinding loss of power through economic collapse. You can have the strongest army and the best secret police, but if your currency becomes worthless, your authority will follow. We saw this in the 20th century with many colonial administrations and later with leaders in South America and Eastern Europe. When hyperinflation hits, the social order breaks down. If a soldier's monthly salary can only buy a loaf of bread, that soldier is no longer going to follow orders to protect the leader. The loss of power happens because the glue that holds the state together, the economy, has turned into water. The leader might stay in the palace, but they find that their commands are ignored, their ministers are fleeing, and their international allies have stopped picking up the phone. It is a hollowed-out form of leadership that eventually collapses under its own weight. We must also talk about the soft coup, or the constitutional removal. This is when a leader is removed through the legal mechanisms of the state, often for misconduct or perceived incompetence. This is the impeachment process, or the vote of no confidence. It is a fascinating way to lose power because it requires the leader's own system to turn against them. We saw this in the United States with Richard Nixon. He wasn't removed by a mob or a general. He was removed because the evidence of his actions became so overwhelming that he lost the support of his own political party. He chose to resign before he could be formally removed, realizing that the power he held was nothing without the backing of the law. This type of exit is a victory for the institutions over the individual, proving that the office is greater than the person currently occupying it. In ancient times, a common way to lose power was through religious or spiritual delegitimization. In many civilizations, the leader was seen as a bridge between the gods and the people. If there was a long drought, a series of earthquakes, or a plague, the people didn't blame the weather. They blamed the leader. They believed the leader had lost the mandate of heaven or the favor of the gods. We see this in the history of China, where natural disasters were often the signal for a new dynasty to rise and the old one to be discarded. This is a psychological loss of power. Once the population believes that the leader is cursed or unholy, their authority disappears even if they still have their wealth and their guards. It is the loss of the moral right to rule, and it's almost impossible to recover from. There are also the bizarre and accidental ways leaders lose power. Some leaders have literally lost their grip on the state because of a sudden health crisis or a freak accident. King Alexander of Greece, for instance, lost his power and his life in 1920 after being bitten by a domestic monkey in the palace gardens. The resulting infection changed the course of Greek politics and led to a massive shift in their military campaigns. This is the butterfly effect of history. A leader can plan for every rebellion and every war, but they can't plan for a random biological event. These exits remind us that despite the grand titles, leaders are just biological organisms subject to the same vulnerabilities as anyone else. The retirement trap is another interesting way leaders lose power. This is when a leader chooses to step down, thinking they can still control the government from the shadows as a gray eminence. We saw this with many Roman emperors like Diocletian, who retired to grow cabbages in his palace at Split, only to watch the empire fall back into civil war. More recently, some leaders in the 20th century tried to hand-pick their successors, only to find that the new person in power immediately moved to erase the old leader's influence. As soon as the seal of office is handed over, the old leader realizes that their friends were actually just friends with the position, not the person. The power doesn't follow the man. It stays with the chair. We cannot ignore the role of foreign intervention. Sometimes, a leader loses power because a more powerful nation decides they shouldn't have it anymore. Throughout the Cold War, the two superpowers were constantly removing leaders across Africa, Asia, and Latin America through covert operations or direct military action. This is the grand chessboard way of losing power. A leader might be doing everything right at home, but if they fall on the wrong side of a global geopolitical conflict, they can find themselves replaced by a more cooperative figure. This is a particularly frustrating way to lose power because it has nothing to do with the leader's actual performance and everything to do with maps and minerals. A more psychological way to lose power is through obsolescence. This happens when the world changes so fast that the leader's way of thinking becomes a relic. Think of the various monarchs at the start of World War I. They were still thinking in terms of 19th century diplomacy and royal family ties. But the world had moved on to industrialized warfare and mass mobilization. They didn't lose power because they were necessarily evil, but because they were irrelevant. The system they were part of had breathed its last breath. And when the war was over, the kings of Germany, Austria, and Russia found that there was no room for them in the new world. It was a loss of power through the sheer passage of time and the evolution of human society. Then there is the scandal of the ego. Some leaders lose power because of a localized personal failing that becomes a national embarrassment. This isn't about policy or war. It's about a lapse in judgment that breaks the father of the nation or mother of the nation image. When a leader is caught in a profound lie or a personal controversy that contradicts the values they claim to stand for, the public's respect can vanish in a heartbeat. Without respect, the leader's words no longer have weight. They might stay in power for a few more months, but they are walking wounded, and the first person who challenges them will find that the leader has no one left to defend them. In some cases, the loss of power is a slow fade. This is common in long-running dynasties or aging dictatorships. The leader becomes physically or mentally frail, and as they decline, the power naturally begins to pool around their subordinates. The leader is still the face of the nation. Their picture is still in every office, but they aren't the ones making the decisions anymore. Eventually, the subordinates realize they don't need the old man anymore, and they move to formalize the situation. This is a transition of power where the leader is the last one to realize they've lost it. They are living in a theater where the audience has already gone home, but the lights are still on. The ideological purge is another dramatic exit. This happens when a revolutionary movement turns on its own founders. In the early days of many new governments, the idealists who started the movement are eventually replaced by the pragmatists or the enforcers. Leaders like Leon Trotsky or some of the early figures of the French Revolution found that the very fire they helped start eventually came for them. They lost power because the definition of the mission changed, and they were no longer on the right side of the line. It's a reminder that revolutionary power is a hungry beast that often requires a constant stream of new leaders to survive. We should also consider the mass resignation. This is a rare but powerful event where a leader's entire cabinet or military leadership resigns at once, leaving the leader with a title but no one to actually do the work. It is a collective strike at the highest level of government. If the generals won't lead the army and the ministers won't run the departments, the leader is essentially fired by their own employees. This often happens at the end of a failed regime when everyone is trying to save their own careers and reputations by distancing themselves from the top. History also shows us leaders who lost power through exhaustion. Sometimes a leader just gives up. The pressure of constant crisis, the endless hours, and the weight of the responsibility becomes too much to bear. They realize that they serve the office, but the office is consuming them. In several instances in European and Asian history, emperors and kings have simply walked away, abdicating in favor of a son or a relative, and choosing to spend their remaining years in a monastery or a country estate. This is perhaps the most graceful way to lose power, recognizing that you are no longer the right person for the job, and letting go before you are forced to. The loss of power of a colonial governor is another specific category. This is when the mother country decides that the colony is no longer worth the trouble and simply packs up and leaves. The leader, who once had the backing of a global empire, suddenly finds themselves alone in a foreign land. Their power was never theirs to begin with. It was a franchise power granted by a distant king or parliament. When the head office closes the branch, the manager loses their job. This happened across Africa and Asia in the middle of the 20th century, as hundreds of governors suddenly found themselves without the authority they had wielded for decades. Why does all of this matter? It matters because the way a leader loses power tells us everything about the society they were ruling. A violent revolution tells us the society was blocked and unfair. A peaceful election tells us the society is flexible and healthy. A palace coup tells us the society was built on personality rather than law. Each exit is a diagnosis of the state's health. If you are a leader, the lesson from history is that your power is a loan, never a gift. Whether it's a loan from the people, the military, the elite, or the gods, it has an interest rate and a due date. The most successful leaders are those who understand this and plan for their own departure. They build institutions that can survive without them, and they know when the time has come to walk away. The most dangerous leaders are those who believe the seat is theirs by right. They are the ones who end up in exile, in a prison, or as the victim of their own daggers. Looking at the maps of the past, the ruins of Rome, the empty palaces of the Qing, the abandoned bunkers of the 20th century, these are all tombstones for the power that was once absolute. They prove that no matter how much a leader is feared or loved, their time at the top is just a tiny flash in the long story of humanity. The system always wins in the end. Whether it's the system of nature, the system of economics, or the system of historical change, the individual leader is just a passenger. The silence that follows a great leader's fall is one of the most poignant moments in history. One day, their name is being cheered or whispered in fear across a continent. The next, people are tearing down their statues or painting over their portraits. The transition from master of the universe to historical curiosity happens in an instant. This evaporation of authority is a fascinating psychological phenomenon. It's like a spell being broken. Suddenly, everyone realizes that the leader was just a person, and the power they had was just a collective hallucination that everyone agreed to believe in. As we conclude this explanation of every way powerful leaders lost power, we should remember that this isn't just about the past. We are living in a time of shifting authority right now. We see digital icons, corporate titans, and political heads of state navigating the same tightropes. The tools are different. Social media instead of daggers, market crashes instead of droughts. But the psychology is identical. A leader is only as powerful as the number of people who choose to listen to them. The history of the fall is a history of human limitations. It is the story of how we try to harness the lightning of power and how, eventually, the lightning always finds its way back to the ground. From the chariots of Egypt to the press conferences of the modern Hall of Power, the story is the same. The chair is always waiting for the next person, and the old person is always heading for the door. Keep your eyes on the horizon of history. By understanding how power was lost in the past, we can better understand how it is being used and misused today. It gives us a sense of perspective. No problem is permanent, and no leader is forever. The great wheel of history keeps turning, grinding down the arrogance of the powerful and making room for the new. That is the ultimate hope of history. The transition of power is the heartbeat of human progress, and while it can be messy and terrifying, it is the only way we keep moving forward. Thank you for exploring the anatomy of the collapse with me. It's been a journey through the high-stakes world of the global elite, and I hope it's given you a new way to look at the headlines and the history books. Stay curious, stay questioning, and always remember that the most powerful thing in the world isn't a crown or an office. It's the knowledge of the past, and the courage to use that knowledge to build a better future. The stage is always set for the next act, and the story of power is one that will never be finished. Until next time, keep looking at the patterns and never stop wondering what happens when the lights go out on the summit of the mountain.